The Maid Who Broke the Unbreakable, a story of silent strength. A billionaire's wife destroyed 9 maids in 6 months until one arrived who couldn't be broken. They said Madame Rose Richards was impossible. Beautiful, wealthy, and cruel beyond measure, she had perfected the art of breaking human spirits with surgical precision. Her mansion on Bishop Adamy Drive stood like a fortress of fear, where staff whispered prayers and counted days until their inevitable escape. But when Naomi walked through those gates carrying nothing but a worn nylon bag and desperate hope for her dying daughter, she brought something Madame Rose had never encountered before. What happened in that house didn't just change two women's lives, it shattered every assumption about power, survival, and what it truly means to be unbreakable. Stay with us to witness how a mother's love became an unstoppable force against calculated cruelty. You'll discover why 9 maids fled in terror while one stayed through slaps, humiliation, and psychological warfare. Learn the shocking moment when Nigeria's most feared socialite crumbled on a marble floor, and uncover the stunning transformation that turned a house of horrors into a home of healing. Because this isn't just about a maid who survived the unsurvivable. It's about the quiet power that emerges when you have nothing left to lose, the unexpected ways trauma shapes both victim and perpetrator, and the miraculous healing that happens when broken people finally see themselves in each other. The truth waiting in this story will forever change how you view strength, dignity, and the invisible battles fought in the shadows of wealth and privilege. The mansion loomed against Lagos's skyline like a monument to untouchable wealth. Behind its towering black gates, perfectly manicured gardens stretched toward a structure that belonged in architectural magazines, all gleaming glass, pristine marble, and calculated perfection. Cars worth more than most people's homes sat polished to mirror brightness in the circular driveway. But those who worked within these walls knew the truth that money's glossy surface concealed. The air inside carried a weight that pressed against your chest, thick with unspoken fear and the memory of tears shed in hidden corners. Staff moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by expensive rugs, their voices barely whispers in the echoing hallways. This was the domain of Madame Rose Richards, and her reign of terror had become Lagos legend. At 33, Rose possessed the kind of beauty that stopped conversations in expensive restaurants. Her skin seemed to glow with its own light, her figure carved to perfection, every outfit chosen to remind observers that they were in the presence of someone who existed on a different plane of existence. When she walked, her designer heels clicked a rhythm of authority against marble floors. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute power. But beneath the silk scarves and diamond earrings lived something darker, a cruelty so refined, so methodical, that it felt almost artistic in its precision. The numbers told the story that whispered rumors only hinted at. 9 maids in 6 months. 9 women who had entered through those imposing gates carrying hope and left carrying scars that would never fully heal. Some ran away in the middle of the night, their uniforms left crumpled on dormitory beds like surrendered flags. Others lasted mere days before the weight of constant humiliation crushed their spirits entirely. One had been found crying behind the gardener's shed at dawn, clutching her few possessions and begging the security guard to open the gates before a madam wakes up. Another simply vanished, leaving only a note that read, "I cannot stay in hell any longer." The household staff who remained, those hardy souls who had somehow found ways to navigate Rose's tempestuous moods, spoke of the departed maids in hushed tones, like survivors recounting fallen comrades. They understood what the outside world couldn't grasp. This wasn't mere employer dissatisfaction or personality conflicts. This was systematic destruction of human dignity, carried out with the precision of a master craftsman. Mama Ronka, the cook whose sturdy frame and steady hands had once prepared meals for government officials, had witnessed the carnage firsthand. She'd seen young women arrive bright-eyed and desperate for work, only to watch them wilt under Rose's withering attention, like flowers in direct sunlight. "That woman has ice where her heart should be," Mama Ronki would whisper to the other staff when Rose was safely out of earshot. "She doesn't just want clean floors and folded laundry, she wants to see you break." The housekeeper, Mrs. Adebayo, had stopped learning new maids' names entirely. What was the point when they'd be gone within weeks? She'd taken to referring to them simply as the new girl, until their inevitable departure made the title meaningless again. But what truly unsettled everyone was the methodical nature of Rose's cruelty. This wasn't random outbursts or momentary anger, it was calculated psychological warfare. She studied each new maid like a scientist examining a specimen, probing for weaknesses, testing pressure points until she found exactly where to apply force for maximum damage. Some she destroyed with impossible standards, demanding floors so spotless that they gleamed like mirrors, only to pour wine across them minutes later while maintaining eye contact. Others she broke with words, cutting observations about their appearance, their intelligence, their worth as human beings delivered with the casual indifference of someone commenting on the weather. The youngest maid, barely 18 and fresh from her village, had lasted only 3 days before Rose's particular brand of psychological torture sent her fleeing. She'd been discovered cleaning a bathroom when Rose entered and began a monologue about how some people are born to serve and some born to be served, while forcing the girl to clean the same spot repeatedly until her hands bled. By the time Mr. Femi Richards returned from his business trips, another empty room would greet him, another resigned letter would sit on his study desk, and his wife would offer vague explanations about staffing challenges and difficult help these days. Femi had built his fortune in oil, transforming himself from a middle-class bank clerk into one of Nigeria's wealthiest men through shrewd investments and an almost supernatural ability to predict market movements. His first wife, Gentle Adni, had been his partner in those early years of struggle and eventual triumph. But cancer had claimed her 12 years ago, leaving a void in the sprawling mansion that no amount of wealth could fill. Rose had entered his life during his darkest period of grief, young and vibrant and seemingly eager to breathe life back into rooms that had grown cold with sorrow. At 22, she'd been everything Aduni wasn't. Flashy where his first wife had been subtle, demanding where Aduni had been accommodating, theatrical where his beloved had been genuinely warm. The marriage had been pragmatic on both sides. Rose needed security and status. Femi needed someone to fill the echoing silence of his empty home. What neither had anticipated was how completely Rose would transform from grateful young bride into the mansion's undisputed tyrant. Now, 11 years later, Femi found himself in the strange position of being wealthy beyond measure, yet somehow powerless in his own home. He'd built a business empire by reading people, understanding their motivations, predicting their next moves. But his own wife remained an enigma wrapped in designer clothing and sharp words. He'd begun spending longer hours at the office, extending business trips, finding reasons to be anywhere but in the beautiful house that had become a battlefield. When he was home, he retreated to his study or the garden, avoiding the common areas where Rose held court and staff walked on metaphorical eggshells. The breaking point had been reached so many times that the phrase had lost meaning. Each departed maid represented another small death of hope, another confirmation that some problems couldn't be solved with money or influence or even love. The household had adapted to live in a constant state of barely controlled chaos, everyone understanding their role in maintaining the illusion of normalcy, while terror ruled behind closed doors. The other wealthy wives in their social circle had begun to whisper. Not openly, Rose's beauty and Femi's influence still commanded respect, but in the subtle ways that high society communicates disapproval. Invitations became less frequent. Phone calls grew shorter. The knowing looks exchanged at charity galas spoke volumes about Rose's reputation, spreading beyond the mansion's walls. She goes through help like tissue paper, one socialite had murmured at a recent luncheon, not knowing Rose was within earshot. I heard the last girl left without collecting her final pay, too scared to ask for it. But Rose seemed to feed on the whispers, the speculation, the growing legend of her impossible standards. If anything, the attention only encouraged her to push boundaries further, to see exactly how much power one person could wield over another before something fundamental broke. The mansion's beautiful facade hid an ecosystem of survival, where remaining staff had developed elaborate strategies for avoiding Rose's wrath. They communicated through glances and hand signals, warning each other when her mood was particularly dark or when she was hunting for someone to torment. They'd learned to disappear into walls when her heels clicked too sharply on the marble, to become invisible when her voice carried that particular edge that meant someone was about to suffer. It was into this carefully balanced world of fear and survival that Naomi would soon walk, carrying nothing but desperation and a mother's love that refused to acknowledge defeat. She would enter a house where 9 women had failed, where cruelty had been refined to an art form, and where everyone understood the unspoken rule. Madame Rose always wins. What none of them knew, not Rose with her calculated cruelty, not the surviving staff with their elaborate survival strategies, not even Femi with his business acumen and deep pockets, was that they were about to encounter something that couldn't be broken because it had already been shattered and rebuilt from different materials entirely. The stage was set for a confrontation between unstoppable force and immovable object, between practiced cruelty and desperate love, between a woman who had made breaking others her specialty and another who had nothing left to lose. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Couldn't Lose. More Naomi Okafor stood at the massive black gates, her reflection distorted in the polished metal surface that separated her from what might be salvation or another kind of hell. The morning sun beat down on her dark skin, already drawing sweat despite the early hour, but she didn't move to wipe it away. Her hands clutched the straps of a worn nylon bag, the kind sold at every Lagos market, faded from repeated use but still holding together through sheer stubborn utility. Inside that bag was everything she owned in the world. 2 changes of clothes, a small plastic bottle of palm oil, a worn leather Bible her mother had given her, and a photograph of her daughter Deborah smiling gap-toothed at the camera before the world had decided to test just how much one small heart could endure. The employment agency woman had been blunt, almost cruel in her honesty. "Look, Naomi, I have to tell you the truth about this position. The madam of the house, she's difficult. Very difficult. 9 girls have left in 6 months. Some lasted days, some weeks, but none lasted long enough to collect their full first month's salary." Naomi had listened in silence, her face revealing nothing of the calculations racing through her mind. The salary being offered was triple what she'd earned at her previous position. Triple. In 1 month, she could earn enough to cover Deborah's medications for 3 months, maybe even enough to afford the specialist consultation that Dr. Adesanya had mentioned. "Why are you telling me all this?" Naomi had asked quietly. The agency woman had looked uncomfortable. "Because you seem different, steadier. The other girls, they were young, full of dreams about working for rich people, expecting to be treated like family. But you—" She'd paused, studying Naomi's face. "You look like someone who understands that survival sometimes requires enduring what others can't." Now, standing before these gates that seemed designed to intimidate, Naomi understood exactly what the woman had meant. This wasn't just about getting a job. This was about entering a war zone where the only weapon she possessed was the kind of desperation that had long since burned away everything except absolute determination. Her daughter was dying. That simple, terrible fact had reorganized every priority in Naomi's universe with brutal clarity. Deborah's heart condition was progressive, expensive, and without proper treatment, ultimately fatal. The doctor spoke in careful, clinical terms about intervention windows and quality of life considerations. But Naomi heard only one message. Time was running out and time cost money they didn't have. The previous 2 years had been a masterclass in discovering how quickly a life could be dismantled by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Naomi's husband, Thomas, had died in a motorcycle accident when Deborah was 7. Just old enough to understand that Daddy wasn't coming home, but too young to comprehend the financial catastrophe his death represented. Thomas had been a mechanic, skilled with his hands and beloved by customers who trusted him with their most prized possessions. But skilled mechanics who worked for other people rather than owning their own shops rarely had comprehensive life insurance. His death had left Naomi with a 7-year-old daughter, mounting medical bills and a collection of tools that no one wanted to buy for what they were worth. The first job after Thomas's death had been cleaning offices in Victoria Island, leaving Deborah with neighbors while Naomi scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans in buildings where people earned more in a day than she made in a month. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was literally cleaning up after wealth, while her own child's health deteriorated from lack of access to the kind of medical care that these office workers probably took for granted. When Deborah's condition worsened and the costs escalated beyond what office cleaning could cover, Naomi had taken a position with a middle-class family in Ikeja. The pay was better, but the husband had developed wandering hands and a sense of entitlement that came with employing someone desperate enough to endure almost anything for steady income. She'd left that position abruptly after refusing his advances one too many times, choosing dignity over financial security in a decision that had felt both necessary and terrifying. For 3 weeks, she'd watched their meager savings dwindle while Deborah's medications ran dangerously low and hospital bills accumulated like storm clouds. That's when desperation had driven her to the employment agency, where promises of higher paying positions came with warnings about impossible employers and working conditions that broke stronger people than herself. You have to understand, the agency woman had continued. Madame Rose Richards isn't just demanding. She enjoys making people suffer. It's not enough for her that the work gets done. She wants to see you break while doing it. Naomi had nodded, filing away this information like intelligence gathered about enemy territory. Because that's what this was. A war for her daughter's life, and she was preparing to enter the most dangerous battlefield she'd ever encountered. But what the agency woman couldn't have known, what none of the previous 9 maids could have understood, was that Naomi had already been broken in ways that made Rose's cruelty seem almost manageable by comparison. She'd held her dying husband's hand as life slipped away from him in a public hospital corridor. She'd watched her daughter struggle to breathe through cardiac episodes that left them both terrified and helpless. She'd begged doctors, hospital administrators, and social workers for help that never materialized. She'd been humiliated by officials who treated her desperation with bureaucratic indifference, threatened by landlords who cared nothing for her circumstances, and ignored by a system that seemed designed to filter out people like her before they could access the help they needed. Most devastating of all, she'd experienced the particular anguish of loving someone more than life itself, while being powerless to save them. Every sleepless night spent watching Deborah's labored breathing, every morning spent calculating how many days her medications would last, every hospital visit that ended with increasingly expensive treatment recommendations had carved away pieces of her spirit until what remained was something harder and more focused than what Rose's previous victims had possessed. The agency woman had mistaken Naomi's quiet intensity for mere steadiness, but what she'd actually observed was the result of a complete transformation. The woman standing at these gates was no longer the optimistic young wife who had once believed that hard work and goodness would be rewarded. That woman had died somewhere between Thomas's funeral and Deborah's first cardiac crisis. What remained was someone who had discovered that when you have absolutely nothing left to lose, you become capable of enduring things that would destroy people who still had hopes to shatter. As Naomi pressed the intercom button, she wasn't thinking about dignity or fair treatment or workplace rights. She was thinking about Deborah's smile when the medications were working, about the way her daughter's eyes lit up when she felt well enough to read her beloved storybooks about the possibility, however remote, that enough money earned quickly enough might buy them time to find a more permanent solution. The voice that crackled through the intercom was sharp, efficient, and clearly annoyed at being bothered. Yes? Good morning. I'm Naomi Okafor from Reliable Domestic Services. I'm here about the housekeeping position. A long pause. Then, wait there. The gates remained closed for another 10 minutes, long enough for Naomi to understand that this delay was intentional, designed to establish hierarchy and test patience before she'd even set foot on the property. Other women might have taken this as an omen, a sign to reconsider their options while escape was still possible. But Naomi simply stood quietly in the morning heat, mentally reviewing everything she knew about the position while watching expensive cars glide past on the street behind her. Each vehicle probably cost more than she would earn in 5 years, but instead of bitterness, she felt only a kind of practical assessment. These were the people she would be working for. People for whom money was so abundant that they could afford to treat other human beings as disposable entertainment. When the gates finally swung open with a mechanical hum that spoke of German engineering and regular maintenance, Naomi walked through without hesitation. She was entering a world where she would be tested, humiliated, and pushed to her absolute limits by someone who had turned cruelty into an art form. But as her worn shoes touched the perfectly manicured driveway, one thought provided an anchor of certainty that Rose Richards couldn't have understood, even if someone had explained it to her. Naomi wasn't here to win or prove anything or maintain her dignity. She was here to save her daughter's life, and people who fight for their children's survival don't surrender just because the enemy is cruel. They endure. They adapt. And sometimes, in ways that surprise everyone, including themselves, they find strength in places that cruelty can't reach. Chapter 3. The art of destruction. The mansion's interior was a study in intimidation, disguised as elegance. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that suggested armies of staff working around the clock to maintain an impossible standard. Crystal chandeliers caught and scattered light across marble floors so polished they served as mirrors, reflecting not just images but revealing every flaw, every imperfection in anyone brave or foolish enough to walk across them. Naomi had barely stepped inside when Mrs. Adebayo, the housekeeper, materialized from what seemed like thin air. She was a woman in her 50s whose face had settled into the permanently cautious expression of someone who had learned that survival required constant vigilance. "You're the new girl," Mrs. Adebayo said, not making it a question. Her voice carried the weight of resigned exhaustion. She'd done this orientation too many times in recent months to invest emotional energy in another face that would likely disappear within weeks. "Yes, Ma. I'm Naomi." Mrs. Adebayo studied her for a moment, taking in the worn but clean clothing, the steady posture, the way Naomi's eyes moved across the opulent surroundings without the wide-eyed wonder that usually marked new arrivals. Most girls who entered this house for the first time couldn't hide their amazement at the wealth surrounding them. But Naomi looked like someone conducting a professional assessment, mentally cataloging what would need to be cleaned, maintained, and managed. "Follow me," Mrs. Adebayo said, already walking toward the back of the house. "I'll show you your quarters and explain the routines. But first, you need to understand something about this house." They passed through rooms that belonged in architectural magazines. A sitting room with Italian leather furniture arranged around a fireplace that probably cost more than most people's cars. A dining room dominated by a table that could seat 20 people beneath another crystal chandelier. A kitchen equipped with professional-grade appliances that gleamed like medical instruments. But despite the obvious wealth, something felt wrong about the spaces. It took Naomi a moment to identify what was missing: warmth. These rooms were beautiful, perfectly appointed, and completely devoid of the comfortable lived-in feeling that made a house feel like a home. Everything looked arranged for photography rather than actual human habitation. "The rules are simple," Mrs. Adebayo continued as they walked. "Madame Rose wakes up at 7. She expects her lemon water, room temperature, not cold, not warm, to be ready the moment she comes downstairs. She takes breakfast at 8 in the sunroom. She doesn't like to see staff unless she's specifically called for us." They reached a narrow staircase that led to the staff quarters, a different world from the mansion's main areas. Here, the floors were concrete, the walls painted in institutional colors, the furnishings basic but functional. "This will be your room," Mrs. Adebayo said, opening a door to reveal a space barely larger than a large closet. A narrow bed, a small dresser, a mirror, and a crucifix on the wall. "You share the bathroom with the other girls down the hall." Naomi set her bag on the bed and nodded. She'd lived in worse conditions, and at least this room was clean and private. "Now," Mrs. Adebayo continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone, "let me tell you what they don't tell you at the agency. Madame Rose isn't just particular about cleanliness or punctuality. She tests people. She pushes to see how much you can take before you break." "What kind of tests?" Mrs. Adebayo looked uncomfortable. "She might spill something deliberately and watch how you react. She might criticize your work even when it's perfect. She might..." The older woman paused, struggling with how much truth to reveal. "She might say things designed to hurt you, just to see if you'll cry or fight back or quit." "I understand. Do you?" Mrs. Adebayo's expression was skeptical. "The girl before you lasted 4 days. She was strong, confident. By the 3rd day, she was crying in her room every night. By the 4th, she was gone." "What did Madame Rose do to her?" "She made her clean the master bathroom 3 times because she said it wasn't spotless. Then she made her wash the same bathroom windows until her hands were raw. Then she criticized her for having rough hands." Mrs. Adebayo shook her head. "But it wasn't really about the cleaning, it was about power. About proving she could make another human being suffer for her entertainment." Naomi absorbed this information without visible reaction. She'd expected as much from the agency's warnings, but hearing specific details helped her understand the battlefield she was entering. "Why do you stay?" Naomi asked. The question seemed to surprise Mrs. Adebayo. I've been here for 8 years. I know how to navigate her moods. And the pay is good enough that I can support my 3 children and send the youngest to university. She paused. But you're different from the other girls who've come through here. How? You don't look scared. Most girls, they come in nervous but hopeful, thinking maybe the stories were exaggerated. You look like someone who already knows exactly what you're walking into. Before Naomi could respond, they heard it. The sharp clicking of heels on marble getting closer. Mrs. Adebayo's entire demeanor changed instantly, her back straightening, her expression shifting to careful neutrality. She's coming, she whispered. Remember, don't look directly at her unless she speaks to you. Don't defend yourself if she criticizes something. Just say, yes, ma'am, and keep working. The footsteps stopped just outside the staff quarters. Then came a voice that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Cultured, melodious, and carrying an undertone of casual cruelty that made Naomi's skin prickle with recognition. Mrs. Adebayo, bring the new girl. I want to see her. Mrs. Adebayo gestured for Naomi to follow, and they walked back through the maze of perfect rooms toward the sound of that commanding voice. They found Madame Rose in the sunroom, arranged in a chair like a queen holding court. Rose Richards was everything the agency had described and more. At 33, she possessed the kind of beauty that looked expensive. Not just naturally beautiful, but enhanced and maintained with the kind of professional care that money could buy. Her skin was flawless, her hair styled in smooth waves that caught the morning light, her silk robe tied with the casual elegance of someone who never doubted her own perfection. But it was her eyes that revealed the truth about what lived beneath the beautiful surface. They were cold, calculating, and completely without warmth as they moved over Naomi like a predator assessing prey. So, Rose said, her voice carrying that dangerous musical quality, you're the latest sacrifice. Naomi bowed slightly. Good morning, Ma. I'm Naomi Okafor. Rose stood and began to circle her, examining her from every angle like someone considering a purchase. The inspection was deliberately dehumanizing, designed to establish dominance before any work had even begun. You're older than the others, Rose observed. Most of the girls they send me are young and stupid. You look like you've lived through some things. Yes, Ma. Good. Maybe you'll last longer than the last few pathetic examples. Rose completed her circle and stood directly in front of Naomi. Do you know why so many girls have quit this position? No, Ma. Rose smiled, and the expression was beautiful and terrifying. Because they came here expecting to be treated like precious flowers. They thought working for wealthy people meant being pampered and appreciated. Her voice hardened. But I don't need appreciation. I need excellence. I need perfection. And I need people who understand that my standards are not negotiable. I understand, Ma. Do you? Rose reached out and picked up a crystal vase from a nearby table. Without warning, she let it slip from her fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, sending glass shards skittering across the perfect surface. Clean it up, she said, her tone conversational. Naomi looked around for cleaning supplies, but Rose held up a hand. With your hands, Rose clarified, that same beautiful, terrible smile playing across her lips. I want to see how carefully you work. Bye! Mrs. Adebayo's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Naomi heard it. This wasn't about cleaning, it was about humiliation, about forcing submission through deliberately dangerous and degrading demands. But as Naomi knelt on the marble floor and began carefully picking up glass shards, her movements precise and unhurried, something unexpected happened. Rose's smile faltered slightly. She'd expected tears, protests, or at least visible fear. Instead, she was watching someone approach the task with the kind of methodical calm that suggested experience with far worse humiliations. Naomi picked up each piece of glass as if it were a precious gem, placing them carefully in her cupped palm. When a sharp edge cut her finger, drawing a thin line of blood, she simply paused to let the blood drop onto her shirt rather than the marble floor, then continued working. You're bleeding, Rose said, watching intently. Yes, Ma, Naomi replied without looking up. I'll finish cleaning this first. The response clearly wasn't what Rose had expected. For the first time since Naomi had entered the room, uncertainty flickered across the beautiful woman's face. Every other maid had either burst into tears at this treatment or refused to continue, giving Rose the reaction she craved. But Naomi was treating the humiliation like just another task to be completed efficiently. When the last piece of glass had been gathered and Naomi stood to dispose of it, Rose tried again. "Your finger is bleeding on my floor," she said sharply. "I'll clean that too, Ma," Naomi replied, pulling a tissue from her pocket to wipe away the few drops of blood that had fallen despite her efforts. Rose stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle that wasn't behaving according to expected patterns. Then she turned abruptly and left the room, her heels clicking against marble with perhaps slightly less confidence than before. Mrs. Adebayo waited until the sound of footsteps faded before approaching Naomi. "Let me see your hand," she said quietly. The cut was shallow but needed cleaning. As Mrs. Adebayo tended to it, she shook her head in amazement. "I've never seen anyone handle her like that before," she whispered. "She was trying to break you right from the start, and you just did the work." Naomi looked at the bandage Mrs. Adebayo was applying to her finger. "My daughter is in the hospital," she said quietly. "If someone wants to humiliate me for money that might save her life, they can humiliate me all day long." Mrs. Adebayo paused in her ministrations, really looking at Naomi for the first time. "How old is your daughter?" 9. She has a heart condition. Understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. "Ah," she said softly. "Now I understand why you're different." She finished bandaging Naomi's finger and handed her a mop and bucket. "Start with the marble floors in the main hallway," she said. "And Naomi, whatever she does to you today, remember that it's not about you. It's about her need to feel powerful. Don't give her the satisfaction of seeing you break." As Naomi filled the bucket with warm water and began her first day of work in the mansion, she understood that Rose Richards had just declared war. The beautiful, terrible woman upstairs had spent months perfecting techniques for destroying other people's spirits, and she clearly saw Naomi as her next conquest. But what Rose couldn't have known was that she was facing an opponent who had already survived the kind of losses that put petty workplace cruelty into perspective. Naomi wasn't here to preserve her dignity or demand respect. She was here to earn money for her daughter's medical care, and she would endure whatever psychological torture Rose could devise if it meant bringing Deborah home healthy. The war had begun, but Rose Richards had made a critical error in her assessment of the enemy. She thought she was facing another young woman who could be broken by strategic cruelty. Instead, she was facing a mother who had already been broken by life itself and rebuilt into something that couldn't be shattered twice. Chapter 4. The Symphony of Silent Warfare. The first week passed in a blur of impossible standards and calculated humiliation. Rose had elevated the destruction of human dignity to a performance art, and Naomi found herself cast as the unwilling audience and main performer in a show designed to prove that everyone had a breaking point. On Monday, Rose discovered a single water spot on a crystal wine glass that had been cleaned to perfection. She didn't just point out the flaw, she gathered the entire household staff to witness Naomi re-washing every piece of crystal in the house, while Rose provided running commentary on proper cleaning techniques, her voice dripping with condescension. "You see," Rose explained to the assembled staff as Naomi worked, "this is what happens when people don't understand the difference between clean and truly clean. In this house, we don't accept mediocrity disguised as effort." Naomi said nothing, simply re-washed each glass with the same methodical care she'd shown the first time, her hands steady despite the audience watching her humiliation. On Tuesday, Rose accused her of tracking dirt across freshly mopped floors. The accusation was impossible. Naomi's shoes were spotless, and she'd been careful to wipe them thoroughly before entering. But Rose made her clean the entire ground floor twice, while maintaining that she could still see footprints that existed only in her imagination. "I don't know how they cleaned floors where you come from," Rose said, settling into a chair to watch the performance. "But in this house, we expect floors clean enough to eat from." By Wednesday, Rose had moved beyond attacking Naomi's work to attacking her personally. She criticized Naomi's hair, her posture, the way she held cleaning supplies, even the rhythm of her breathing while she worked. Each criticism was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone commenting on the weather. "Hold that mop properly," Rose commanded during the afternoon cleaning session. You look like a farm girl who's never seen proper equipment before. When Naomi adjusted her grip, Rose immediately found fault with the new position. Not like that. Are you deliberately trying to look incompetent? Do you think this is some village compound where standards don't matter? The attacks continued until Thursday afternoon when Rose made a mistake that revealed the calculated nature of her cruelty. She'd been watching Naomi clean the master bathroom when she deliberately knocked a perfume bottle to the floor, then immediately began screaming about carelessness and destruction of property. But her reaction was too quick, too practiced. For just a moment, Naomi caught something in Rose's expression, a flash of satisfaction that had nothing to do with genuine anger and everything to do with someone enjoying a performance they'd orchestrated themselves. That evening, as Naomi sat in her small room treating blisters that had formed from excessive cleaning, she realized that she was witnessing something more complex than simple cruelty. Rose wasn't just trying to establish dominance or maintain impossible standards. She was performing pain, creating drama, manufacturing emergencies and conflicts because she needed them for some reason that went deeper than mere power hunger. The recognition should have been devastating, understanding that someone was torturing her purely for entertainment. Instead, it clarified everything about the battlefield she was fighting on. Rose needed reactions. She fed on fear, tears, anger, and desperation the way normal people fed on food. Every previous maid had given her exactly what she craved, and their inevitable departures had provided the ultimate satisfaction, proof of her ability to destroy another human being completely. But Naomi had something Rose had never encountered before, a purpose so overwhelming that Rose's psychological games felt like minor inconveniences rather than major trauma. When you've held your child's hand during cardiac episodes that might be their last, someone calling you stupid while you clean their bathroom doesn't register as life-altering crisis. Friday brought the escalation Naomi had been expecting. Rose had clearly grown frustrated by her lack of visible response to the week's torment, and frustration in someone accustomed to total control rarely led to surrender. It started before dawn. Naomi woke to find her uniform missing from the small closet where she'd hung it the night before. In its place was a sheer nightgown that obviously didn't belong to her, something expensive and completely inappropriate for housework. The message was clear. Either humiliate yourself by wearing something designed to make you uncomfortable and exposed, or face Rose's wrath for being improperly dressed. It was the kind of psychological trap that had probably broken previous maids within hours. Naomi stared at the nightgown for exactly 30 seconds, then reached for her own clean t-shirt and wrapper. She dressed carefully, ensuring everything was neat and modest, then began her morning duties exactly as if nothing had happened. When Rose descended the marble staircase at her usual 7 o'clock hour, her eyes immediately fixed on Naomi's clothing, with predatory satisfaction. "What?" Rose said, her voice carrying across the foyer like a whip crack. "Are you wearing?" Naomi paused in her floor mopping and bowed slightly. "Good morning, Ma. I'm wearing clean clothes." "Those are not your uniform." "No, Ma. My uniform wasn't in my room this morning." Rose's smile was beautiful and deadly. "So, you decided to dress like you're going to the market instead of working in a respectable home?" "I dressed in clean, modest clothing appropriate for housework, Ma." The response clearly wasn't what Rose had expected. She'd anticipated tears, excuses, desperate explanations about the missing uniform. Instead, Naomi had simply solved the problem and moved on, refusing to be drawn into the drama Rose was trying to create. But Rose was far from finished. If clothing manipulation wouldn't work, she had other weapons in her arsenal. "You know," Rose said, settling into a chair position to give her the best view of Naomi's continuing work. "I've been thinking about your background. Where exactly did you work before this?" "Various households in Lagos, Ma." "Various households," Rose repeated mockingly. "That's what people say when they've been fired from multiple positions. What did you do wrong at these various households?" Naomi continued mopping, her movements steady and efficient. "I left some positions for personal reasons, Ma." "Personal reasons?" Rose's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Let me guess. You were caught stealing. Or maybe you were caught with someone's husband. That's usually what happens with your type." The words were designed to wound, to provoke anger or tears or desperate self-defense. But Naomi had faced accusations before, from landlords who needed excuses not to return deposits, from employers who wanted to avoid paying final wages, or from officials who saw defenseless women as convenient scapegoats. I left my last position because my daughter needed more medical care than my schedule allowed, Ma, Naomi said quietly, wringing out her mop with the same careful attention she gave everything. Rose leaned forward, sensing an opening. Ah, the sick daughter story. How convenient. Is she actually sick, or is that just what you tell employers when you want sympathy? Something shifted in the air. Mrs. Adebayo, who had been arranging flowers in a nearby vase, went completely still. Even Mama Ronke, preparing breakfast in the distant kitchen, seemed to pause in her work. Because while Rose had crossed many lines in her campaigns of cruelty, questioning a mother's love for her sick child touched something deeper than workplace humiliation. It ventured into territory that revealed not just cruelty, but genuine malice. Naomi stopped mopping. For the first time since entering the house, she looked directly at Rose, and what Rose saw in those eyes made her unconsciously lean back in her chair. My daughter has a congenital heart defect, Naomi said, her voice still quiet but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room. She's 9 years old, and without surgery, she'll die before her next birthday. I'm working here because this job pays enough to save her life. The absolute certainty in Naomi's voice, the complete absence of defensive anger or pleading, created a moment of silence that stretched between them like a held breath. Rose had expected tears, denials, or desperate explanations. Instead, she was facing someone stating facts with the kind of flat honesty that came from having nothing left to hide or protect, except the one thing that mattered most. How touching, Rose finally said, but her voice lacked its usual sharp confidence. Another sob story designed to make me feel guilty for maintaining standards. I'm not asking you to feel anything, Ma, Naomi replied, returning to her mopping. I'm just answering your question. And that was when Rose made her first critical error in the psychological war she'd been waging. Frustrated by Naomi's refusal to break down or fight back, she decided to escalate to physical intimidation. She stood abruptly and walked over to where Naomi was working. Without warning, she kicked the bucket of mop water, sending dirty water splashing across the marble floor and Naomi's clothes. Clean it again, Rose commanded, all of it, and this time try not to make such a mess. Mrs. Adebayo gasped audibly. Mama Ronke appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of shock. Even in a house where cruelty had become routine, this crossed a line that left everyone stunned. But Naomi simply looked down at the spreading puddle, then at her soaked clothes, then back at the mess. She walked calmly to the utility closet, retrieved another bucket and fresh cleaning supplies, and began cleaning up the water Rose had deliberately spilled. She worked without speaking, without crying, without showing any emotion except the focused concentration she brought to every task. When she finished, the floor was spotless again, and she began the process of mopping the entire area a second time. Rose watched this response with growing unease. Every previous maid would have quit on the spot, or at least shown some sign that they'd been broken by such deliberate humiliation. But Naomi was treating the incident as just another obstacle to work around, no more significant than discovering she needed to replace a worn mop head. Don't you have anything to say? Rose demanded, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been desperation. Naomi paused in her mopping and looked up. Would you like me to say something specific, Ma? The question was asked with such genuine curiosity that Rose found herself momentarily speechless. She'd spent years perfecting techniques for breaking people, but she'd never encountered someone who responded to escalating cruelty by essentially asking for clearer instructions. I want you to show some proper respect, Rose said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. I am showing respect, Ma. I'm doing the work you've asked me to do. You're supposed to, Rose started, then stopped because she couldn't actually articulate what she expected without revealing the ugly truth about her motivations. She was supposed to what? Cry? Beg? Quit in humiliation? Provide the emotional reaction that Rose needed to feel powerful and in control? For the first time in years, Rose found herself facing someone who refused to participate in the psychological theater that had become her primary source of satisfaction. Naomi wasn't giving her anger to feed on, tears to savor, or desperation to enjoy. She was simply working, enduring, and treating Rose's cruelty as weather to be navigated rather than attacks to be survived. That evening, as Rose sat in her room applying expensive creams to skin that had never known real hardship, she found herself thinking about Naomi's steady, unremarkable response to every humiliation she'd devised. For the first time since she'd begun her campaign of cruelty against household staff, Rose was facing an opponent who seemed genuinely indifferent to her power. And that indifference was more threatening to her sense of control than any rebellion could have been. Because what was the point of being feared if someone simply didn't care enough to be afraid? Chapter 5. The Cracks in the Foundation. Saturday morning arrived with unusual quiet. Rose had spent Friday evening in her room, missing dinner and avoiding the common areas where she might encounter Naomi, continuing her work with that maddening, unshakable calm. For the first time in months, the household staff moved through their routines without the oppressive weight of impending drama. Naomi woke before 5, as had become her habit, and began her morning duties in the pre-dawn darkness. She swept the front courtyard, cleaned the glass doors until they were invisible, and mopped the main floors with the careful attention to detail that had become her trademark. But today felt different. Yesterday's confrontation had shifted something fundamental in the house's atmosphere. The other staff members looked at Naomi with a mixture of awe and concern. Awe that she'd survived Rose's most vicious assault yet, and concern about what escalation might come next. "She's never had someone last this long," Mrs. Adebayo whispered to Mama Ronki as they prepared for the day. "The longest anyone has survived her attention was 2 weeks, and that girl was crying every night by the end." "This one is different," Mama Ronki replied, kneading dough for the morning bread with perhaps more force than necessary. "She doesn't cry. She doesn't argue. She just endures." "That's what worries me," Mrs. Adebayo said. "Madame Rose doesn't know how to handle someone who won't break, and when she doesn't know what to do, she gets dangerous." Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected sound. Footsteps on the marble stairs, but not the sharp clicking of Rose's heels. These were the softer, measured steps of Mr. Femi Richards, who rarely appeared in the common areas during morning hours. Femi emerged from the staircase looking like a man who hadn't slept well. At nearly 60, he carried his wealth and power with the ease of someone born to both. But recent months had etched new lines around his eyes and added weight to his movements. He found Naomi in the main hallway, methodically cleaning the crystal light fixtures with a soft cloth, her movements precise and unhurried. She sensed his presence and turned to offer a respectful bow. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, Naomi." His voice was quieter than she'd expected, lacking the commanding presence she associated with wealthy men. "How are you settling in?" The question seemed genuine rather than perfunctory, which surprised her. In her experience, employers rarely inquired about their staff's comfort, unless they were building up to criticism or dismissal. "Very well, sir. Thank you for asking." Femi studied her face for a moment, noting the absence of the stress and fear that had marked every other maid's tenure. "I understand you have a daughter." "Yes, sir. She's 9. "And she's unwell?" Naomi paused in her cleaning, uncertain how much information was appropriate to share. "She has a heart condition, sir. She's currently in the hospital." Femi nodded slowly. He'd overheard fragments of yesterday's confrontation between his wife and this remarkably composed woman, and what he'd heard had left him deeply uncomfortable. "The medical care in Lagos can be challenging to navigate," he said carefully. "Yes, sir, but we're managing." The understatement was delivered with such quiet dignity that Femi found himself genuinely impressed. Here was a woman facing every parent's worst nightmare, a seriously ill child and insufficient resources to provide proper care. Yet she carried herself with more grace than most people facing minor inconveniences. "If there's anything," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to offer help without overstepping boundaries or creating complications with his wife. "Thank you, sir," Naomi said, understanding both the gesture and its limitations. "Your employment provides what we need most." After Femi left for his office, Naomi continued her work, but she was aware that something had shifted. For the first time since arriving, she'd felt a moment of genuine human connection within these marble walls. That sense of cautious optimism lasted exactly until Rose made her appearance. She descended the stairs at 9:30, 2.5 hours later than her usual time, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But despite the expensive clothing and perfectly applied makeup, something was different about her demeanor. Rose looked like someone who had spent the night wrestling with uncomfortable thoughts and losing. "Naomi," she called, her voice lacking its usual sharp authority. "Come here." Naomi approached with her usual respectful manner, but she was immediately aware that Rose's energy felt unstable, unpredictable in a way that was somehow more dangerous than calculated cruelty. "I've been thinking," Rose said, settling into her favorite chair with less than her usual graceful control. "About yesterday, about your situation." Naomi waited silently, every instinct warning her that whatever came next would be significant. "Your daughter," Rose continued, her voice carrying an odd mixture of curiosity and something that might have been vulnerability. "How long has she been sick?" The question was so unexpected that Naomi took a moment to respond. "Since birth, Ma, but it's gotten worse in the past 2 years." "And her father? Where is he in all this?" "He died 3 years ago, Ma. Motorcycle accident." Rose absorbed this information with an expression that was impossible to read. For several minutes, she said nothing, simply staring out the window at gardens that were maintained to perfection by staff who worked around her moods and demands. "I lost my mother when I was 13, Rose said suddenly, the words emerging as if she hadn't intended to speak them. Naomi remained silent, sensing that any response might break whatever fragile moment of honesty was occurring. "People think that marrying money solves everything," Rose continued, her voice growing softer and more distant. "They see the house, the clothes, the cars, and they assume I've never wanted for anything." She turned to look directly at Naomi for the first time in their acquaintance, without calculation or cruelty in her expression. "But they don't see the parts that money can't buy. The feeling of belonging somewhere. The sense that people value you for who you are rather than what you represent." Naomi found herself in completely uncharted territory. This vulnerable woman bearing her soul was so different from the calculating tormentor she'd come to know that it felt like meeting an entirely different person. "Money is a tool, Ma," Naomi said quietly. "It can solve some problems, but it can't heal everything that gets broken." Rose's eyes sharpened slightly as if Naomi's words had touched something she'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. "What do you know about being broken?" she asked, but without her usual venom. "I know that everyone gets broken differently," Naomi replied. "Some people break when they lose what they have. Some people break when they realize they never had what they thought they needed." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither woman was quite ready to cross. Rose looked away first, her hands smoothing the silk of her robe in a gesture that seemed more nervous than elegant. "Your daughter," she said, returning to safer ground. "What do the doctors say?" "They say she needs surgery. 2 procedures, possibly 3. It's expensive, but it would give her a normal life. And without it?" Naomi's pause spoke volumes. "Without it, we love her as much as we can for as long as we can." Something in Rose's expression cracked slightly. For just a moment, her carefully maintained mask of control slipped, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. "Go," she said suddenly, her voice rougher than before. "Continue your work." As Naomi left the room, she was aware that she'd just witnessed something unprecedented in their relationship. For a few minutes, Rose had allowed her humanity to show, dropping the performance of cruelty that seemed to define her interactions with everyone around her. But what troubled Naomi as she returned to her duties was the recognition that Rose's vulnerability might be more dangerous than her calculated meanness. Cruelty she could endure because it was external, something that came from outside herself. But if Rose began to show genuine humanity, it would complicate everything about their carefully balanced dynamic. Because it's much harder to maintain emotional distance from someone when you begin to understand the pain that drives their worst behaviors. And Naomi couldn't afford emotional complications. She was here for one purpose only, to earn money for her daughter's medical care. Getting drawn into Rose's psychological dramas, whether cruel or vulnerable, threatened to undermine the focused determination that was keeping her functional. That afternoon, as she cleaned the guest rooms with her usual methodical care, Naomi made a conscious decision to maintain professional distance regardless of how Rose chose to present herself. She would endure the cruelty without letting it break her, and she would observe the vulnerability without letting it soften her resolve. Because at the end of the day, Rose was a wealthy woman playing psychological games while Naomi was a desperate mother fighting for her child's life. Whatever pain drove Rose's behavior, it couldn't compare to the stark reality of watching your child suffer from something you couldn't fix. Naomi's compassion was a finite resource, and every bit of it belonged to Deborah. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point That Never Came. The following week brought a shift in Rose's tactics that left the entire household walking on eggshells. Having failed to break Naomi through traditional humiliation and having inadvertently revealed vulnerability that made her feel exposed and angry, Rose began experimenting with more sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. Monday started with Rose deciding that Naomi's cleaning wasn't thorough enough, despite the fact that even Mrs. Adebayo had to admit the work was exemplary. Rose insisted that every surface Naomi had cleaned be cleaned again, but this time while Rose provided running commentary on proper technique. You see how you're holding that cloth? That's not how we do things in a proper household. In my mother-in-law's house, they would never accept such sloppy attention to detail. The criticism was delivered in the tone someone might use to teach a child, calculated to infantilize and belittle. But Naomi simply adjusted her grip and continued working, absorbing the feedback as if it were genuine instruction rather than designed humiliation. Tuesday brought accusations of theft. Rose claimed that a small crystal figurine was missing from her dressing table and that Naomi must have taken it. The accusation was absurd. Naomi had been in the presence of other staff members during every moment of her shift, and she'd never shown the slightest interest in the expensive decorative objects scattered throughout the house. I'm not accusing you directly, Rose said with false reasonableness, but these things don't just disappear. Perhaps you moved it while cleaning and forgot where you put it. They spent 2 hours searching for the figurine, with Rose maintaining the pretense that this was a reasonable request rather than deliberate harassment. The figurine was eventually found exactly where it belonged. Rose had simply moved it earlier and forgotten. How careless of me, Rose said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I suppose I owe you an apology. But no apology came, and everyone understood that the entire episode had been theater designed to waste Naomi's time and energy while demonstrating Rose's power to create crises from nothing. Wednesday escalated to physical sabotage. Rose began following Naomi through her cleaning routine, deliberately undoing work that had just been completed. She would track mud across freshly mopped floors, scatter dust on newly polished surfaces, and rearrange items that had been carefully organized. Oh dear, she would say with exaggerated concern. It looks like you missed a spot. Better start over. The other staff watched these performances with growing discomfort. What Rose was doing went beyond the usual employer prerogatives and into the realm of pure malice. But none of them could intervene without risking their own positions, so they were forced to witness the systematic torment of someone they'd grown to respect. But Thursday brought something unexpected. The day Rose's carefully orchestrated cruelty finally backfired in a way she couldn't control or explain away. It started normally enough. Rose had decided that the guest bathroom needed to be cleaned to hospital standards, and was supervising Naomi's work with her usual catalog of impossible demands. She wanted the mirror cleaned until it was perfectly transparent, the tiles scrubbed until they gleamed like jewels, and the fixtures polished to showroom perfection. Naomi worked steadily through each requirement, her movements efficient and thorough. But no matter how perfectly she completed each task, Rose found fault. That's not clean enough. Do it again. The mirror still has streaks. Obviously, you don't understand proper glass cleaning. Those tiles look dull. What kind of cleaning products did they use where you worked before? The criticism continued for over an hour, with Rose's voice growing increasingly sharp and her demands increasingly irrational. She was building towards something some moment of maximum humiliation that would finally provoke the breakdown she craved. That moment came when she decided to inspect Naomi's work by running her finger across surfaces that had been cleaned multiple times, making disgusted faces and pronouncing everything inadequate. "This is unacceptable," Rose declared, her voice rising to the level where other staff members could hear from downstairs. "I've been patient with your substandard work, but this is beyond incompetent. This is willful disrespect for my home and my standards." She was building to a crescendo, preparing to deliver the kind of verbal assault that had sent previous maids fleeing in tears. But as she took a breath to launch into her final attack, something stopped her. Naomi was sitting on the bathroom floor, her back against the bathtub, looking not defeated or angry or ready to quit, but simply exhausted. Not the dramatic exhaustion of someone pushing toward a breakdown, but the deep, bone-weary tiredness of someone who had been running on determination alone for longer than should have been humanly possible. "Ma," Naomi said quietly, "may I ask you something?" The unexpected question derailed Rose's prepared speech entirely. "What? What would you like me to do differently?" Rose blinked, momentarily confused. "I just told you, the cleaning is inadequate." "Yes, Ma, but what specifically would you like me to change? I've cleaned every surface multiple times using different techniques and products. I've followed every instruction you've given me. If the result still isn't what you want, I need to understand what I'm missing." The question was asked without defensiveness or sarcasm, with the genuine tone of someone trying to solve a problem. And that sincerity revealed something that Rose had been trying to avoid acknowledging. Her demands weren't actually about cleanliness. They were about power, control, and the psychological satisfaction of watching someone suffer under impossible standards. But when confronted with someone asking for specific, actionable feedback, the emptiness of her complaints became impossible to ignore. I... Rose started, then stopped, because she couldn't articulate what she actually wanted without admitting that her goal was Naomi's misery rather than clean bathrooms. In that moment of hesitation, something fundamental shifted between them. Rose realized that she'd been caught in her own performance, exposed as someone whose cruelty served no purpose beyond her own psychological needs. And Naomi, looking at Rose's uncertainty and discomfort, felt something she hadn't expected: pity. Because in that moment, she could see clearly what Rose had been trying to hide. This wasn't a powerful woman exercising legitimate authority. This was someone so empty inside that she needed to create pain in others to feel alive, so insecure that she could only feel valuable by making others feel worthless. Rose was trapped in a performance of power that had become indistinguishable from the prison of her own psychological needs. "Ma," Naomi said gently, "would you like me to clean this bathroom again, or would you prefer that I work on something else?" Aida. The question was asked with such genuine respect and patience that it highlighted the absurdity of the entire situation. Here was someone offering to continue working, despite being subjected to deliberate harassment, someone maintaining professionalism in the face of calculated cruelty. And Rose, confronted with such undeserved grace, felt something she hadn't experienced in years: shame. Not the performative shame of someone caught in wrongdoing, but the deep, uncomfortable recognition that she had become someone she didn't like, someone whose behavior couldn't be justified, even to herself. "No," she said finally, her voice smaller than it had been all morning. "You can work on something else." Bawon. As Naomi gathered her cleaning supplies and left the bathroom, Rose remained sitting on the edge of the bathtub, staring at her reflection in the mirror that had been cleaned to absolute perfection. For the first time in months, she was alone with silence that wasn't filled with the sound of someone suffering under her direction. And in that silence, she was forced to confront the question she'd been avoiding. What kind of person had she become? The answer waiting in the mirror was not someone she recognized or wanted to be. Chapter 7. The Mirror's Reflection. That evening, Rose didn't come down for dinner. Mrs. Adebayo knocked softly on her bedroom door to announce that the meal was ready, but received only a muffled "leave it outside" in response. By 10 o'clock, the untouched tray still sat in the hallway, growing cold while the house settled into an unusual quiet. Without Rose's presence commanding attention and creating tension, the staff moved through their evening routines with something approaching normalcy. Naomi finished her duties and retreated to her small room. But instead of the bone-deep exhaustion that had characterized her previous nights, she found herself restless and oddly alert. Something had changed during the afternoon's confrontation, though she wasn't sure what or how. She sat on her narrow bed holding the small photograph of Deborah that she kept tucked in her Bible. In the picture, her daughter was smiling despite the hospital gown and the medical equipment visible in the background, her eyes bright with the kind of irrepressible joy that serious illness hadn't been able to dim. "Hold on, baby," Naomi whispered to the photograph. "Mama's working hard to bring you home healthy." It was nearly midnight when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the purposeful stride of someone moving with determination, but the aimless wandering of someone who couldn't sleep. The footsteps paused outside her door, then continued down the corridor before returning several minutes later. Finally, a soft knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," Naomi called, quickly tucking the photograph back into her Bible. Rose entered wearing a simple cotton nightgown instead of her usual silk, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face clean of makeup. Without the armor of expensive clothing and careful presentation, she looked younger and somehow smaller than the imposing figure who commanded the household during daylight hours. "I couldn't sleep," Rose said, as if this explained her presence in the staff quarters at midnight. Naomi gestured to the single chair in the room. "Would you like to sit?" Rose remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture that seemed more protective than cold. "I wanted to, that is, about this afternoon." She trailed off, apparently struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone accustomed to giving orders rather than explanations. "You wanted to apologize?" Naomi asked gently. "I wanted to understand something." Rose's voice was quieter than Naomi had ever heard it. "Why don't you quit?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple employment concerns. "I need the money, Ma," Naomi replied simply. "But surely there are other positions. Other households where you wouldn't have to—" Rose gestured vaguely, unable to articulate what she'd been putting Naomi through. "Other positions don't pay as well, and my daughter doesn't have time for me to find something perfect." Rose sat down heavily in the chair, her carefully maintained posture forgotten. "Tell me about her, your daughter." Naomi pulled the photograph back out, offering it to Rose. "Her name is Deborah. She loves books and drawing, even when she's too tired to hold a pencil properly. She wants to be a teacher when she grows up." Rose studied the photograph for a long moment, taking in the child's bright smile and the medical equipment that framed it. "She looks like you." "People say that, but she's braver than I've ever been." "How?" "She faces every day knowing that her heart might stop working, but she still makes plans for the future. She still talks about the books she wants to read and the places she wants to visit. She still believes that everything will work out." Rose handed the photograph back carefully as if it were made of something precious and fragile. "And you're here working for someone who—" Again, she couldn't finish the sentence. "You're here employing someone who needs this opportunity more than she needs dignity," Naomi said matter-of-factly. The blunt honesty seemed to hit Rose like a physical blow. "That's not— I never meant—" "Ma," Naomi interrupted gently, "you don't have to explain your behavior to me. I'm here to work, not to judge." "But you do judge. Everyone judges. The staff here, they'd look at me like I'm some kind of monster." Naomi considered this carefully before responding. "I think they look at you like someone who has more power than she knows what to do with." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that when you have everything you need, it becomes hard to remember what it feels like to have nothing. And sometimes that makes people cruel without meaning to be." Rose stood abruptly and began pacing the small room, her movements agitated and restless. "You think I don't know what it's like to have nothing? You think I was born into all this?" "I don't know anything about your background, Ma." "I was 13 when my mother died," Rose said, the words coming in a rush as if she'd been holding them back for years. 13, and suddenly, I was living with relatives who made it clear every day that I was a burden. They fed me, clothed me, sent me to school, but they never let me forget that I was charity case. Naomi listened in silence, sensing that Rose needed to speak more than she needed responses. Do you know what it's like to be grateful for scraps? To say thank you for every meal, every piece of clothing, every small kindness while knowing that it could all be taken away at any moment? Yes, Naomi said quietly. I do know. Rose stopped pacing and turned to look at her. Of course you do. That's why you won't quit no matter what I do to you. Yes, Ma. And that's why you won't fight back. Fighting back would be a luxury I can't afford. Rose stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. But it was a sound without humor, bitter and self-directed. Do you know what I thought when I married Femi? I thought I would never have to be grateful again. Never have to smile when someone insulted me. Never have to accept cruelty as the price of survival. And now? Now I realize I just switched sides. Instead of enduring cruelty, I became the person dispensing it. Rose's voice broke slightly. I became everything I hated about the people who had power over me. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Rose had stripped away all pretense and revealed the ugly truth about what she'd become and why. Ma, Naomi said carefully, why are you telling me this? Because you're the first person who's ever looked at me without fear or hatred or greed. You just look at me like I'm a person, a complicated, flawed person, but still just a person. Because that's what you are? Even after everything I've done to you? Naomi was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. My daughter taught me something when she first got sick. She said that hurt people sometimes hurt other people, but that doesn't make them bad people. It just makes them people who need healing. Rose's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for what felt like years. I don't know how to stop being cruel. It's become so automatic, so much a part of who I am. The same way you learn to be cruel, Naomi said gently. One choice at a time. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unexpected honesty settling between them. Finally, Rose stood to leave. Naomi? Yes, Ma? Thank you for not leaving, for not giving up, for seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there. After Rose left, Naomi sat alone in her small room, staring at her daughter's photograph and trying to process what had just happened. In the space of one conversation, her tormentor had transformed into something approaching a human being, wounded, confused, but genuinely sorry for the pain she'd caused. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something much more complicated than the simple endurance test she'd prepared herself for. Because it's much easier to endure cruelty from a monster than to forgive genuine remorse from a person. Chapter 8. The Slow Thaw. The next morning brought subtle but unmistakable changes to the household's atmosphere. Rose appeared for breakfast at her usual time, but something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. She still wore her designer clothes and perfectly applied makeup, but the sharp edge of barely contained cruelty had been replaced by something harder to define. A kind of careful uncertainty, as if she was learning to navigate social interactions all over again. Good morning, Mrs. Adebayo, she said as she entered the dining room, and the housekeeper nearly dropped the silver serving tray she was carrying. In 3 years of employment, Rose had never acknowledged her with anything more than a nod or a direct order. Good morning, Ma, Mrs. Adebayo replied, her voice carefully neutral despite her obvious surprise. When Naomi appeared with Rose's usual morning lemon water, Rose looked up from her newspaper and said, Thank you, Naomi. The words were simple, but their impact on the room was immediate. Mama Ronki paused in her breakfast preparations. The gardener, visible through the dining room windows, seemed to slow his movements as if sensing a shift in the household's energy. Naomi placed the glass gently on the table. You're welcome, Ma. It was a small exchange, barely noteworthy in most households, but in a home where thank you had been as rare as snow in Lega, it felt revolutionary. The changes continued throughout the day in ways both subtle and significant. Rose still maintained her exacting standards for household management, but she began expressing them differently. Instead of accusations and insults, she offered specific feedback. Instead of creating impossible scenarios designed to frustrate, she provided clear instructions and allowed time for completion. Naomi, when you're cleaning the crystal, could you use the microfiber cloths instead of the cotton ones? They don't leave residue, she said during the afternoon cleaning session. It was still a correction, but delivered as information rather than criticism. Naomi nodded and made the adjustment, noting how different the interaction felt when it served the actual purpose of improving results rather than simply asserting dominance. The other staff members watched these exchanges with cautious amazement. They'd witnessed Rose's campaigns of psychological warfare against previous maids, and they understood they were seeing something unprecedented. But years of walking on eggshells had taught them to be wary of apparent improvements that might be temporary. "She's being strange today," Mama Ronke whispered to Mrs. Adebayo during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "Strange good or strange bad?" Mrs. Adebayo replied, automatically lowering her voice despite Rose being upstairs. "Just strange. Like she's trying to remember how to be normal." It was an apt description. Rose moved through her day like someone consciously practicing unfamiliar behaviors, occasionally catching herself mid-sentence when her old patterns of speech threatened to emerge. But the most significant change came during the evening routine. For months, Rose's presence during cleaning hours had been a source of anxiety for everyone involved. She would appear suddenly, find fault with completed work, and create drama that left staff members shaken and demoralized. Tonight, she appeared in the main hallway where Naomi was dusting the elaborate table arrangements, but instead of beginning her usual inspection routine, she simply stood quietly and watched. "Ma?" Naomi asked, sensing Rose's presence and turning to acknowledge her. "I was wondering," Rose began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to phrase whatever she wanted to say. "Would you mind if I asked about your daughter's condition? I mean, if you're comfortable discussing it." The request was so different from Rose's usual demands that Naomi needed a moment to process it. "Of course, Ma. What would you like to know?" "The doctors you mentioned, are they at a government hospital or private?" "Government hospital, Ma. Lagos University Teaching Hospital." Rose nodded slowly. "And the surgery she needs, have they given you a timeline?" "They want to do the first procedure within the next 3 months, if possible. The longer we wait, the more complicated it becomes." "How much does something like that cost, if you don't mind my asking?" Naomi set down her dusting cloth, recognizing that this conversation deserved her full attention. "The surgery itself is about 2.8 million naira, but with hospital stay, medications, follow-up care, probably closer to 3.5 million total." Rose's eyes widened slightly. It was a sum that represented serious money even to someone of her wealth, certainly far beyond what any domestic worker could hope to save from regular wages. "And you're trying to earn that while working here?" "As much as I can, Ma. The hospital will do the surgery if we can provide half the cost up front and guarantee payment for the rest." "So you need almost 2 million naira just to begin?" "Yes, Ma." Rose fell silent, apparently doing calculations in her head. Naomi returned to her dusting, not wanting to make the conversation more uncomfortable by staring. "Naomi," Rose said finally, "I want you to know that I understand now why you stayed, why you endured, what I put you through." "You don't need to explain anything, Ma." "Yes, I do." Rose's voice carried a firmness that hadn't been present in their previous conversations. "Because what I did to you was wrong. Not just unprofessional or unfair, it was cruel for the sake of being cruel, and you deserved better." Naomi looked up from her work, surprised by the directness of the apology. "I was angry," Rose continued, "but not at you. I was angry at my own life, my own choices, my own emptiness. And I took that anger out on people who couldn't fight back. We all carry pain, Ma. The question is what we do with it. What do you do with yours?" Naomi considered the question carefully. "I try to use it to understand other people's pain. My daughter taught me that suffering either makes you harder or more compassionate. I decided to try for compassionate. Even when people don't deserve your compassion? Especially then, because those are usually the people who need it most." Rose stared at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're remarkable, you know that?" "I'm just a mother trying to save her child, Ma." "No, you're much more than that. You're—" Rose paused, searching for the right words. You're the kind of person I thought I was before life made me bitter." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Naomi felt the weight of it, the trust it represented for someone who had clearly spent years protecting herself behind walls of cruelty and control. "Ma," Naomi said gently, "bitterness isn't permanent. People can change if they want to." "Do you really believe that?" "I have to, because if people can't change, then there's no hope for any of us." That night, Rose lay in her king-sized bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman sleeping in the servants' quarters below. For years, she'd defined herself in opposition to the people who had once had power over her. She would never again be grateful for scraps, never again accept humiliation as the price of survival, never again allow anyone to make her feel small and powerless. But in building those defenses, she'd become something worse than the people who had hurt her. She'd become someone who used her power to create the same pain she'd once endured. Naomi had survived Rose's deliberate cruelty not through hardness or bitterness, but through a kind of grace that Rose had forgotten was possible. She'd maintained her dignity not by fighting back, but by refusing to let cruelty change who she was at her core. And in doing so, she'd held up a mirror that showed Rose exactly what she'd become, and what she might still choose to be. For the first time in years, Rose fell asleep thinking not about what others had done to her, but about what she might do for someone else. Chapter 9. The Turning Point. 2 weeks passed in this new, cautious routine. Rose continued to moderate her behavior, speaking to staff members with something approaching respect, and treating Naomi's work with professional rather than personal criticism. The household began to relax incrementally, like people emerging from a long winter and tentatively believing that spring might actually arrive. But the real transformation began on a Thursday morning when Rose made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She woke before dawn with unusual restlessness, her mind churning with thoughts that had been building for days. The conversation with Naomi about her daughter's medical costs had lodged itself in her consciousness like a splinter, creating a discomfort that grew stronger each time she thought about it. By 6 o'clock, she was dressed and in her study, making phone calls that would have been impossible to imagine just a month earlier. "Dr. Adebayo, this is Rose Richards." "Yes, Femi's wife. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Yeah, I need information about cardiac surgery for children in Lagos. Specifically, I want to know about the best facilities available and what kind of costs are involved." The conversation that followed was lengthy and detailed. Dr. Adebayo, a family friend and one of Lagos's most respected cardiologists, patiently explained the complexities of pediatric cardiac care, the various surgical options available, and the dramatic differences between public and private healthcare systems. "The child you're asking about," he said near the end of their conversation, "is this someone you know personally?" "She's the daughter of someone who works for us," Rose replied carefully. "Ah, well, if the family is working with Luth, they're in capable hands medically. Dr. Okonkwo runs an excellent cardiac program there, but the waiting list can be lengthy and the costs, well, they can be prohibitive for most families." What if money wasn't the primary concern? What would be the optimal care scenario? Dr. Adebayo was quiet for a moment. For a pediatric cardiac case? Probably the Heart Institute at Lagos Island Medical Center. They have the most advanced equipment and the shortest wait times. But we're talking about significantly higher costs, probably doubles what Luth would charge. After ending the call, Rose sat in her study making notes and calculations that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her history with household staff. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of power and responsibility. For years, she'd used her wealth as a weapon, a tool for creating distance between herself and people she saw as beneath her consideration. But watching Naomi's quiet dignity in the face of desperate circumstances had revealed another possible use for privilege: healing instead of hurting. At 7:30, she went downstairs to find Naomi preparing her usual morning lemon water. "Naomi, when you finish that, could you come to my study? I'd like to discuss something with you." The request, delivered without the sharp edge that had characterized most of Rose's previous summons, still caused a moment of anxiety. Despite the recent improvements in Rose's behavior, years of experience had taught household staff to approach any private meeting with caution. "Of course, Ma," Naomi replied, finishing her preparations and following Rose upstairs. Rose's study was a room that Naomi had cleaned many times but never really examined. Now, sitting in a leather chair across from Rose's desk, she noticed details that revealed the woman's complexity. Law books mixed with poetry collections, business journals alongside art magazines, photographs of charitable events next to pictures of Rose with society figures. Naomi, Rose began, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic uncertainty. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your daughter's medical care. Naomi's posture straightened slightly, alert to whatever direction this conversation might take. I made some calls this morning to get more information about cardiac surgery options in Lagos. I spoke with Dr. Adebayo. He's one of the best cardiologists in the country and a friend of my husband's family. Yes, Ma? He confirmed that Luth provides excellent care, but he also mentioned that there are facilities with more advanced equipment and shorter waiting periods. Naomi nodded politely, unsure where this information was leading. The Lagos Island Medical Center has a specialized cardiac institute. According to Dr. Adebayo, they could probably schedule your daughter's surgery within a month, rather than waiting for an opening at the government hospital. I'm sure that's true, Ma, but private hospitals are beyond what I can afford. Rose took a deep breath, as if preparing to cross a bridge that couldn't be uncrossed. What if cost wasn't a factor? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Naomi was afraid to interpret. I don't understand, Ma. I'm offering to pay for your daughter's surgery, all of it, at the best facility available. Naomi stared at her, certain she'd misunderstood something fundamental about the conversation. Ma, that's not... I couldn't possibly accept... Why not? The simple question revealed the complexity of what Rose was proposing. Because the obvious answers, pride, independence, the impossibility of accepting such massive charity, suddenly seemed less important than the life of a 9-year-old girl. It's too much, Naomi said finally. Too much for what? Too much money? I spend more than that on jewelry I never wear. Too much responsibility? Your daughter's life isn't my responsibility, but helping her could be my choice. Rose leaned forward, her expression more serious than Naomi had ever seen it. Naomi, I've spent the last several years using my wealth to hurt people, to make myself feel powerful by making others feel small. That's not who I want to be anymore. Ma, you don't owe me anything. I chose to stay here despite everything. That was my decision. You're right, I don't owe you anything. But maybe I owe it to myself to do something worthwhile with the privileges I've been given. Naomi felt tears building behind her eyes, the first tears she'd shed since arriving at the mansion. Why would you do this? Because you taught me something I'd forgotten. You showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that comes from hurting others, but the kind that comes from enduring pain without letting it make you cruel. Rose stood and walked to the window, looking out at gardens that were maintained by people whose names she'd never bothered to learn until recently. I've been powerful for years, but I've never done anything powerful. This would be something powerful. Naomi struggled to find words adequate to the moment. The offer was so far beyond anything she'd imagined possible that she felt disoriented, as if the fundamental rules of her universe had suddenly changed. My daughter, she said finally. She's just a little girl who loves books and wants to be a teacher. She doesn't know about any of this. The job, the difficulties, the money problems. She still believes that everything will work out because good things happen to good people. Maybe she's right. Maybe good things do happen to good people. Maybe it just takes a while sometimes. Rose turned back to face Naomi, her expression resolute. I'm going to call Dr. Adebayo back and arrange for your daughter to be transferred to Lagos Island Medical Center. They'll do a complete evaluation and schedule whatever procedures are necessary. Ma, I can't let you... You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it. There's a difference. Naomi bowed her head, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered and the transformation it represented in the woman sitting across from her. There's one condition, Rose added. Naomi looked up, prepared for whatever requirement might come with such generosity. I want to meet her, your daughter. I want to visit her in the hospital and see for myself the person I'm helping. Of course, Ma, she would be honored to meet you. No, Rose said firmly. I would be honored to meet her, because if she's anything like her mother, she's someone worth knowing. That afternoon, Rose made a series of phone calls that set in motion a chain of events that would transform two lives completely. Dr. Adebayo arranged for Deborah's transfer to Lagos Island Medical Center. Rose's personal assistant coordinated the logistics. Financial arrangements were made that ensured the best possible care without any cost to Naomi. But perhaps most significantly, Rose began to understand that true power wasn't about controlling others. It was about using your advantages to lift up people who deserved better than what life had given them. And for the first time in years, she went to sleep feeling proud of who she was becoming, rather than ashamed of who she'd been. Chapter 10. The Meeting of Hearts. The Lagos Island Medical Center existed in a different universe from the crowded public hospital where Deborah had been receiving treatment. Private rooms with windows, nursing staff who had time to smile, equipment that hummed with efficient modernity rather than struggling through mechanical old age. Rose arrived precisely at visiting hours, carrying a small gift bag and wearing a simple dress that managed to be elegant without being ostentatious. She'd spent an hour that morning choosing an outfit that wouldn't intimidate a 9-year-old girl, eventually settling on something that conveyed warmth rather than wealth. Naomi met her in the lobby, her face glowing with a happiness that had been absent for months. "Ma, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Deborah is like a different child. She's excited about everything, asking a million questions about the doctors and the machines, and when she can go home healthy. How is she feeling about the surgery? She's nervous but excited. The cardiologist here, Dr. Emeka, he explained everything to her using pictures and models. She understands that her heart needs fixing, and she trusts that these doctors can fix it." They rode the elevator to the pediatric cardiac unit in comfortable silence. Rose found herself unexpectedly nervous about meeting a child whose medical bills she'd agreed to pay. "What did you say to a 9-year-old whose life you were helping to save?" The nervousness evaporated the moment she saw Deborah. The little girl was sitting up in a hospital bed that looked more like a regular bedroom, reading a book about space exploration and humming softly to herself. She had her mother's deep, thoughtful eyes and a smile that seemed to generate its own light. "Debbie," Naomi said softly, "this is the lady I told you about, Mrs. Rose." Deborah looked up from her book and offered a shy smile. "Hello, Mrs. Rose. Mama said you're helping the doctors fix my heart." "Hello, Deborah. I'm very pleased to meet you." Rose approached the bed slowly, mindful not to overwhelm the child with too much adult energy. "What are you reading?" "It's about astronauts who go to Mars. Did you know that the heart has to work harder in space because there's no gravity to help blood flow?" The question was asked with the kind of earnest curiosity that made Rose smile genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I didn't know that. That's fascinating." "I want to be a teacher when I grow up," Deborah continued, warming to her favorite subject. "I want to teach children about science and help them understand how their bodies work, like how the heart is really just a pump that moves blood around to carry oxygen to all your cells." Rose found herself charmed, not just by the child's intelligence, but by her enthusiasm for learning, despite being surrounded by medical equipment that reminded everyone of her fragile health. "That sounds like a wonderful career choice. What made you want to be a teacher?" Deborah considered the question seriously. "Because when people understand how things work, they're not scared of them anymore. Like when the doctor explained about my heart surgery, I was scared at first, but then he showed me exactly what they would do and why. And now I'm excited instead of scared." Rose glanced at Naomi, who was watching the conversation with obvious pride in her daughter's wisdom and resilience. "You know," Rose said, settling into the chair beside Deborah's bed, "I think you're going to be an excellent teacher. You already understand something that many adults never learn." "What's that?" "That knowledge is more powerful than fear?" Deborah grinned, obviously pleased by this adult recognition of her insight. "Mama says that too. She says that when you understand why things happen, you can figure out what to do about them." They talked for another hour about books, science, space exploration, and Deborah's plans for when she was all fixed up and ready to run around again. Rose found herself genuinely engaged in conversation with a child whose intellectual curiosity and emotional maturity seemed far beyond her years. But it was when visiting hours were ending that Deborah said something that would stay with Rose for years to come. "Mrs. Rose," the little girl said as Rose prepared to leave, "thank you for helping my mama help me." "You're very welcome, sweetheart. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you decide to help us? Mama says you don't even know us very well." Rose paused, recognizing that this child deserved an honest answer rather than empty platitudes about charity and kindness. "Because your mama taught me something important," she said finally. "She showed me that strong people don't hurt others, they help them. And I wanted to be strong the right way." Deborah nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 9-year-old understanding of the world. "I think you're very strong," she said matter-of-factly, "and very kind. When I'm a teacher, I'm going to tell my students about you and how you helped us when we needed help the most." As Rose left the hospital that evening, she carried with her the image of a little girl whose heart was failing, but whose spirit seemed absolutely unbreakable. Deborah faced an uncertain future with curiosity rather than fear, approaching her medical challenges as problems to be solved rather than tragedies to be endured. But more than that, she'd shown Rose something that all the wealth and privilege in the world couldn't buy. The kind of grace that comes from accepting help with gratitude rather than shame, and the wisdom to see kindness clearly even when it comes from unexpected sources. That night, Rose called her husband, who was traveling on business, to tell him about the day's events. "You paid for a stranger's child's heart surgery?" Femi asked, his voice carrying surprise but not disapproval. "She's not a stranger anymore," Rose replied. "She's a remarkable little girl who deserves every chance to grow up and become the teacher she wants to be." "And her mother?" Rose was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain the transformation that had occurred in her understanding of strength, power, and what it meant to be worthy of the privileges she'd been given. "Her mother saved my life," she said finally. "How?" "By showing me who I could choose to be instead of who I'd become." The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. A routine procedure made safer by advanced equipment and a team of specialists who treated pediatric cardiac care as both science and art. Rose found herself counting down the days with an anxiety that surprised her in its intensity. She'd become invested not just in the outcome, but in the process, visiting Deborah every few days and bringing books, puzzles, and small gifts that delighted the child without overwhelming her. More importantly, she'd begun to understand that healing Deborah was also healing something fundamental in herself, the part of her spirit that had been damaged by years of choosing cruelty over compassion, power over purpose. As the surgery day approached, Rose discovered that she was praying for the first time in years. Not the perfunctory prayers of someone going through religious motions, but the desperate, heartfelt pleas of someone who had finally found something worth believing in. Because Deborah's life had become more than just a medical procedure to be funded. It had become proof that people could change, that wealth could heal rather than hurt, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was help someone else become everything they were meant to be. Chapter 11, The Day of Transformation. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that Lagos sometimes offered before the heat and humidity of the day took hold. Rose woke at 5 o'clock, too nervous to sleep longer, and spent the pre-dawn hours in her study making lists of things that needed to be done and phone calls that needed to be made. But beneath the activity, she was simply trying to manage the anxiety that had been building for days. Somehow, Deborah's surgery had become the most important thing in Rose's life, more crucial than any business deal or social event she'd ever been involved with. At 7 o'clock, she drove to the hospital, arriving in time to see Naomi walking beside Deborah's gurney as they wheeled her toward the surgical suite. The little girl was alert but clearly nervous, clutching a small stuffed elephant that Rose had brought her the previous week. "Mrs. Rose," Deborah called when she spotted her in the corridor. "You came to see me off." "Of course I did, sweetheart. I wanted to wish you luck and remind you that you're going to do great. Dr. Amika says the surgery will take about 4 hours, and when I wake up, my heart will work properly for the first time in my whole life." "That's exactly right. And when you're all healed, you can start training to become the best teacher Lagos has ever seen." Deborah grinned, and some of her nervousness seemed to ease. Will you be here when I wake up? I'll be here as long as you want me to be. As they reached the surgical suite, Naomi leaned down to kiss her daughter's forehead. I love you, baby girl. I'll see you in a few hours. I love you too, Mama. And Mrs. Rose, thank you for helping my heart get fixed. Rose felt tears threaten for the second time since arriving at the mansion months ago. Thank you for letting me help. The waiting began then. 4 hours that stretched like days, filled with periodic updates from surgical nurses and endless cups of coffee that neither Rose nor Naomi actually wanted to drink. They sat together in the family waiting room, an oddly matched pair who had somehow become united by their concern for the little girl undergoing surgery floors above them. Ma, Naomi said during one of the long silences, I need you to understand something. What's that? What you've done for us. It's not just about the money or the surgery or the medical care. It's about dignity. Rose looked at her questioningly. For the first time in years, I feel like someone sees my daughter as worth saving. Not as charity case or someone to be pitied, but as a person who deserves the best possible care because her life has value. Her life does have value, enormous value. I know that, but it means everything that you know it too. They were interrupted by Dr. Amika, still in surgical scrubs, approaching with the kind of expression that made both women hold their breath. The surgery went perfectly, he said, and Rose felt her knees go weak with relief. We were able to repair the defect completely, and Deborah's heart is already functioning much more efficiently than before. Naomi pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely. She'll need to stay in the hospital for about a week for monitoring and recovery, but the prognosis is excellent. With proper follow-up care, she should be able to live a completely normal life. When can we see her? Rose asked. She's in recovery now. Give us about an hour to get her settled in the post-operative unit, and then you can visit briefly. After Dr. Amika left, Rose and Naomi sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Deborah's life had been saved. The cloud of uncertainty and fear that had hung over them for months had finally lifted. Ma, Naomi said finally, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me. You've already given me more than I gave you. How? You gave me the chance to be someone I could respect. For years, I used my wealth to hurt people because it made me feel powerful. But helping Deborah, this is the first time I've felt truly powerful. The power to heal instead of hurt. When they were finally allowed to see Deborah, she was groggy from anesthesia, but alert enough to smile weakly when she saw them. Did it work? She asked, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. It worked perfectly, Naomi said, stroking her daughter's hair. Your heart is all fixed. Does this mean I can run around and play sports and do everything normal kids do? After you heal completely, yes, you can do anything you want. Deborah's smile grew stronger. I want to learn to swim and play football and maybe learn to dance. All of that and more, Rose said. The world is going to be amazed by everything you accomplish. Over the following week, Rose visited the hospital daily, bringing books and games and simply spending time with a child who was discovering what it felt like to have a heart that worked properly. She watched Deborah's color improve, her energy increase, and her natural enthusiasm for life expand as physical limitations disappeared. But the transformation wasn't just in Deborah. Rose found herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. The cynicism that had characterized her interactions with the world began to give way to something approaching optimism. The emptiness that had driven her to seek power through cruelty was being filled by the satisfaction of using her advantages to create positive change. Most surprisingly, she discovered that she actually enjoyed spending time with the hospital staff, learning about their work and their lives, treating them as individuals rather than service providers. The head nurse, a woman named Sister Mary who had spent 20 years caring for children with heart conditions, became someone Rose genuinely looked forward to talking with. You know, Sister Mary said one afternoon as they watched Deborah working on a puzzle, in all my years here, I've never seen anyone transform the way you have. What do you mean? You came here as someone doing charity for a child you didn't know, but you've become someone who genuinely cares about that child's future, someone who sees her as a person rather than a project. Rose considered this observation. I think Deborah and her mother saved me more than I saved them. How so? They showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that comes from having power over others, but the kind that comes from using whatever power you have to lift others up. On the day of Deborah's discharge, Rose arrived to find the little girl dressed in regular clothes rather than hospital gowns, sitting in a wheelchair and practically vibrating with excitement about going home. Mrs. Rose, look at me. I'm all better. Dr. Amika says my heart is working perfectly and I can do anything I want. That's wonderful, sweetheart. What's the first thing you want to do when you get home? I want to run. Just run around our neighborhood and feel what it's like to run without getting tired. Rose laughed, infected by the child's joy. That sounds like an excellent plan. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Deborah hugged Rose tightly. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for saving mine, Rose replied, and meant it completely. The ride back to the mainland was filled with Deborah's chatter about her plans for recovery, her excitement about returning to school, and her determination to become the best teacher in all of Nigeria. Rose found herself making promises to help with school fees, to provide tutoring when needed, and to be present for whatever milestones and achievements lay ahead. But more than that, she found herself genuinely excited about the future. Not just Deborah's future, but her own. For the first time in years, she was looking forward rather than backward, thinking about what she could build rather than what she could control. Chapter 12. The New Foundation. 3 months after Deborah's surgery, the mansion on Bishop Adamy Drive had become an entirely different place. The transformation was so complete that longtime staff members sometimes paused in their work, amazed by the atmosphere of genuine warmth that had replaced the previous climate of fear and tension. Rose still maintained high standards for household management, but she expressed them through collaboration rather than domination. She learned the names of every staff member, asked about their families, and began treating the house as a home where people worked together rather than a battlefield where she asserted dominance. "Good morning, Mama Ronka," she would say as she entered the kitchen for breakfast. "How is your grandson doing in school?" "Very well, Ma, thank you for asking. His mathematics is improving since we got him that tutor you recommended." "Excellent. And Mrs. Adebayo, did your sister's surgery go well last week?" "Yes, Ma. She's recovering nicely. Thank you for the time off to be with her." These conversations would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier, but they had become the new normal in a household where the mistress had learned to see her employees as human beings with lives and concerns beyond their work duties. But the most significant change was in Rose's relationship with Naomi, which had evolved from employer-employee to something approaching genuine friendship. Naomi had officially been promoted to head of household operations, with increased responsibilities and a salary that reflected her value to the family's daily life. More importantly, Rose had begun involving Naomi in decisions about the household's management, recognizing that someone who had worked efficiently under the most difficult circumstances might have valuable insights about how things could be improved. "I've been thinking about the staff quarters," Rose said one morning as they reviewed the week's schedules. "They're adequate, but they could be more comfortable. What would make the biggest difference for everyone's quality of life?" Naomi considered the question carefully. Better ventilation would help during the hot season, and perhaps a common room where people could relax together in the evenings. "Those sound like excellent improvements. Would you work with me to plan the renovations?" It was this kind of collaboration that had transformed not just the physical environment, but the emotional climate of the entire household. Staff members who had once moved through their duties with fearful efficiency now worked with something approaching enthusiasm, knowing that their efforts were appreciated rather than taken for granted. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the relationship between Rose and Deborah, which had grown into something beautiful and unexpected. The little girl visited the mansion regularly, often doing her homework in Rose's study while Rose worked on her various projects. "Mrs. Rose," Deborah said one afternoon, looking up from a science textbook, "what's photosynthesis?" "It's the process that plants use to turn sunlight into energy. Like how your heart turns oxygen into fuel for your body, but plants do it with light instead of air." "That's so clever. Plants are like solar-powered people." Rose laughed, delighted by the child's way of making complex concepts accessible through analogy. "That's exactly right. You're going to be an amazing teacher. I hope so. I want to help other kids understand how wonderful science is. These conversations had become a highlight of Rose's days. Deborah's curiosity was infectious, her insights often surprising, and her gratitude for her restored health a constant reminder of what truly mattered in life. But the changes extended beyond the mansion's walls. Rose had begun using her wealth and social connections to support other families facing medical crises they couldn't afford to address. She'd quietly funded 3 more pediatric surgeries, established a scholarship program for children from low-income families, and begun working with Dr. Adebayo to create a foundation focused on cardiac care for children. You know, Femi said one evening as they sat together in the garden, something that had rarely happened during the previous years of their marriage. I barely recognize the woman I'm married to. Is that good or bad? Rose asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. It's wonderful. You're like the person I thought I was marrying, but even better. Better how? More purposeful, more generous, more yourself, if that makes sense. Rose considered this. I think I was angry for so long that I forgot who I actually wanted to be. Naomi reminded me. By enduring your anger? By refusing to let my anger change who she was. She showed me that real strength isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling yourself. About choosing who you want to be regardless of how others treat you. Femi reached over and took her hand, a gesture of intimacy that had been absent from their marriage for years. I'm proud of the woman you've become. I'm finally proud of her too. 6 months after the surgery, Rose organized something that would have been unthinkable during her previous life. A celebration dinner to honor Deborah's complete recovery and return to normal activities. But instead of the formal, intimidating affairs that had characterized her previous entertaining, this was a warm, inclusive gathering that brought together an unlikely group of people. Dr. Emeka and his wife attended, along with Sister Mary from the hospital. Dr. Adebayo came with his family. All of the household staff were invited as guests rather than servers, sitting at the same table as people who would normally have been completely outside their social circle. But the guests of honor were Naomi and Deborah, who arrived dressed in new outfits that Rose had insisted on providing for the occasion. This is like a fairy tale, Deborah whispered to her mother as they entered the dining room, which had been decorated with flowers and candles that created an atmosphere of celebration rather than formality. Sometimes real life can be like a fairy tale, Naomi replied, when people choose to be kind instead of cruel. The dinner conversation flowed easily among the diverse group, with Deborah charming everyone by explaining her latest school projects and her plans for the upcoming science fair. Rose found herself genuinely enjoying the company of people she'd never have considered socializing with during her previous life. Deborah, Dr. Emeka said during dessert, "What are you going to present at the science fair?" "I'm doing a project about how the heart works," she replied enthusiastically. "I want to show other kids that heart problems aren't scary when you understand what doctors can do to fix them." That sounds like an excellent project. Will you explain what happened during your own surgery? Oh, yes. I'm going to use models and pictures to show exactly what Dr. Emeka did to repair my heart. And I'm going to explain why it's important for kids to know that medicine can solve problems that seem impossible. Rose listened to this exchange with deep satisfaction. Deborah was transforming her own medical experience into a way to help other children, demonstrating the same kind of grace and purpose that had characterized her mother's approach to adversity. After dinner, as guests began to leave, Dr. Adebayo approached Rose with a proposal that would extend her transformation even further. "Rose, I've been thinking about our conversations regarding pediatric cardiac care. Would you be interested in joining the board of the Children's Heart Foundation? We could use someone with your resources and organizational skills." "I'd be honored," Rose replied immediately. "What would my responsibilities be?" "Primarily fundraising and program development. We're trying to expand access to cardiac surgery for children whose families can't afford private care. Someone with your social connections could make a significant difference." Rose felt a familiar excitement building, but this time it was focused on creating positive change rather than asserting dominance. "I'd like to start by establishing an endowment fund, something substantial enough to ensure ongoing support for families in Naomi and Deborah's situation." That would be transformational. How substantial are you thinking? 50 million naira to start. More as we identify additional needs. Dr. Adebayo's eyes widened. Rose, that would fund dozens of surgeries and support services. You're talking about saving hundreds of children's lives. Then let's start saving them. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Rose found herself alone with Naomi and Deborah, cleaning up the dining room together in a scene that perfectly captured how much their relationship had evolved. Mrs. Rose, Deborah said as she carefully stacked dessert plates, this was the best party I've ever been to. Why is that, sweetheart? Because everyone was happy. Really, genuinely happy. Not pretending to be happy or trying to impress anyone, just happy to be together. Rose paused in her cleaning, struck by the 9-year-old's insight into the difference between genuine celebration and social performance. You know what, Deborah? This was the best party I've ever hosted too, for exactly the same reason. Later that evening, after Naomi and Deborah had returned home, Rose sat in her study making notes about the foundation work she wanted to pursue. But her thoughts kept returning to the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. Less than a year ago, she'd been a woman so empty inside that she could only feel alive by making others suffer. She'd used her wealth as a weapon, her beauty as armor, and her intelligence as a tool for psychological destruction. But one determined woman caring nothing but love for her dying daughter had walked into her life and refused to be broken by cruelty. In refusing to be broken, Naomi had shown Rose that there were other ways to use power, other ways to find meaning, other ways to be strong. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. Rose had to consciously choose compassion over cruelty, collaboration over domination, healing over hurting. Some days the choice was harder than others, when old patterns of behavior threatened to reassert themselves. But every time she looked at Deborah, healthy, vibrant, pursuing her dreams of becoming a teacher, Rose was reminded of what was possible when privilege was used for purpose, rather than simply for personal satisfaction. Rose opened her laptop and began drafting a letter to the other wealthy families in their social circle, inviting them to join the Children's Heart Foundation as founding supporters. She wrote about the transformative power of using wealth to heal rather than simply to accumulate, about the satisfaction that came from knowing your advantages had created genuine positive change in the world. But mostly she wrote about a little girl who wanted to be a teacher, and a mother who had taught Rose that real strength came not from breaking others, but from refusing to be broken yourself. As she worked late into the night, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. Not excitement about acquiring more wealth or social status or power over others, but excitement about the possibility of using what she had to create more moments like tonight's dinner, genuine celebration among people who had chosen kindness over cruelty, healing over hurting, love over fear. And at the center of it all was the quiet recognition that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply choose to be better than you had been before. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time. Because change wasn't about dramatic gestures or grand proclamations. It was about the daily decision to treat other people as if their lives had value, their struggles had meaning, and their dreams deserved support. Rose had learned this lesson from a woman who carried nothing but love and determination, and she intended to spend the rest of her life proving worthy of the gift she'd been given. Epilogue: The Ripple Effect. 2 years later, the mansion on Bishop Adamy Drive had become known throughout Lagos not for its intimidating grandeur, but for the warmth that radiated from within its walls. The Children's Heart Foundation, headquartered in Rose's former sitting room, had funded 43 surgeries and provided support services to over 200 families facing pediatric cardiac crises. Deborah, now 11, had indeed won the science fair with her presentation about heart surgery. She'd gone on to become a volunteer at the foundation, helping other children understand their medical procedures and providing the kind of peer support that only someone who had walked the same path could offer. Mrs. Rose, she said one Saturday morning as they reviewed applications for the foundation's newest scholarship program, look at this girl's essay. She wants to become a doctor so she can help kids like us. Rose read the application from a 12-year-old whose heart surgery had been funded by the foundation 6 months earlier. The girl wrote about wanting to pay forward the kindness that saved my life by becoming a pediatric cardiologist. That's beautiful, Deborah. She sounds like exactly the kind of person we want to support. I think so too. And Mrs. Rose, I've been thinking about something. What's that? When I become a teacher, I don't just want to teach regular school subjects. I want to teach kids about kindness, about how choosing to be good to each other can change everything. Rose looked at the young woman Deborah was becoming, confident, compassionate, purposeful in ways that had nothing to do with her medical history and everything to do with the values she'd absorbed from her mother and the community that had embraced her. I think that might be the most important subject anyone could teach, Rose said. Naomi, now the Foundation's operations director, approached their table with a stack of letters. These came in today's mail, she said, settling into a chair beside them. Thank you notes from families we've helped. Rose took the letters, still amazed by the gratitude people expressed for help she could provide so easily. But what moved her most were the updates about children's progress, their return to normal activities, their dreams for the future. Read this one, Naomi said, pointing to a letter near the top of the stack. Rose opened it to find a drawing of a family holding hands, accompanied by a note written in careful cursive. Dear Mrs. Rose, thank you for fixing my little brother's heart. He can play football now, and he wants to be a football player when he grows up. My mama cries happy tears every day. You are an angel. Love, Kemi, age 8. These letters are the reason I get up every morning, Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. I know, Naomi replied. And they're the reason I'm grateful every day that I didn't quit that first week when you were testing my limits. Rose laughed, remembering the woman she'd been just 2 years earlier. Can you imagine if you had quit? What would have happened to all of us? Someone else would have broken and left, and you would have continued being miserable until someone else came along to challenge you. Do you really think someone else could have gotten through to me? Naomi considered this carefully. I think you were ready to change. You just needed someone to show you how. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else eventually. I'm glad it was you. So am I. That afternoon, Rose received a call that would expand their work even further. The Ministry of Health wanted to discuss partnering with the Children's Heart Foundation to establish cardiac care centers in 3 additional Nigerian cities. Mrs. Richards, the ministry official said, your foundation has become a model for how private philanthropy can complement public health care. We'd like to explore scaling your approach nationally. I'd be very interested in that conversation, Rose replied. When can we meet? As she scheduled the meeting, Rose reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. She'd gone from someone who used wealth to create misery to someone who used it to heal. From someone whose power came from making others feel small to someone whose influence came from helping others grow. But the most profound change was internal. The emptiness that had driven her to seek satisfaction through cruelty had been filled by the deep contentment that came from purposeful work. She no longer needed to prove her worth by diminishing others because she'd found worth in lifting others up. That evening, as had become their custom, Rose, Naomi, and Deborah sat together in the garden, watching the sunset paint the Lagos sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Deborah was reading aloud from a book about famous teachers throughout history, her voice strong and clear, as she described educators who had changed the world through their dedication to their students. You know what I love about teacher stories? Deborah said, looking up from her book. They're all about people who saw potential in others that those people couldn't see in themselves. That's a beautiful observation, Rose said. What made you think of that? Well, Mama saw potential in you that you couldn't see in yourself. You saw potential in me that I didn't know I had. And now we're all helping other people see their potential. It's like kindness spreading from person to person. Rose felt tears prick her eyes. Still a relatively new experience for someone who had spent years refusing to let herself feel genuine emotion. Deborah, has anyone ever told you that you're going to change the world? Mrs. Rose, I think we already are changing the world. One family at a time, one surgery at a time, one act of kindness at a time. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rose understood that Deborah was absolutely right. Change didn't require grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It required the daily choice to treat other people as if they mattered, to use whatever advantages you possess to create opportunities for others, and to remember that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserved the chance to become the best version of themselves. The mansion on Bishop Adamy Drive had become proof that even the most broken people could heal. Even the cruelest hearts could learn compassion, and even the emptiest lives could be filled with purpose. And it had all started with one woman who refused to quit, who chose endurance over surrender, who demonstrated that real strength came not from breaking others but from refusing to be broken yourself. In the end, Rose had learned the most important lesson of her life from someone she'd tried her hardest to destroy. That love, for a child, for justice, for the possibility of a better world, was indeed more powerful than fear, more lasting than cruelty, and more transformative than all the wealth in the world. The ripples of that lesson would continue spreading long after the last patient had been treated, the last scholarship awarded, the last thank you note received. Because kindness, once unleashed, has a way of multiplying beyond imagination, creating a legacy that no amount of money could ever buy, and no act of cruelty could ever destroy. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Rose often thought about the worn nylon bag that Naomi had carried through the mansion's imposing gates all those months ago. It had contained so little in material terms, a few clothes, a photograph, a mother's desperate hope, but it had also carried the power to transform lives, heal hearts, and prove that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest choice: to keep going when everything tells you to stop, to choose hope when despair seems more reasonable, and to believe that tomorrow can be better than today if someone is brave enough to make it so. That choice, repeated day after day by ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, was what really changed the world. And Rose was grateful beyond measure to have learned this truth from a woman who embodied it so completely. The maid who couldn't be broken had broken the cycle of cruelty instead, replacing it with something infinitely more powerful: the healing force of unconditional human dignity, offered freely even to those who seemed least deserving of grace. In the end, that grace had saved them all,